health inspector showed up at my door flanked by two police officers, a fire marshal, and a clipboard so thick it could knock out a medium-sized animal. I was in the middle of pulling ribs off my smoker, the kind of ribs that glisten in the afternoon sun like they've been lacquered by the barbecue gods themselves, when this parade of authority marched into my yard. 5 paying customers were seated around my outdoor table, already arguing about who would get the burnt ends, and my peach cobbler was still finishing in the brick oven I'd built myself over 2 patient weekends. The health inspector cleared his throat with theatrical self-importance before announcing that he had received an official complaint accusing me of operating a commercial food establishment in a residential neighborhood. And of course, the complaint came from none other than Margaret Susan Blackwell, our HOA president and the self-appointed empress of Silverstone Gardens. The women believed the faintest hint of hickory smoke was an act of domestic terrorism, and she once told me that my barbecue sauce was too bold for the refined palates of the neighborhood. She said palates, but I'm convinced she meant people she personally approves of, which was a list that rarely extended beyond her husband and her poodle. What she didn't know was that she had just started a war she was destined to lose. I'm David Garrett, former Marine, current remote software developer, and a man whose dedication to smoking meat is something between a hobby and a religion. When I moved into Silverstone Gardens 3 years earlier, I thought I'd found a peaceful suburb with wide yards, quiet streets, and the kind of neighbors who wave without wanting to be your best friend. The HOA seemed like a minor annoyance, a paper tiger with a fondness for newsletters and rules about mailbox paint that no one actually enforced. After my company went fully remote, I suddenly had more time on my hands, and what started as weekend gatherings with friends turned into something more structured. I jokingly called it Garrett's Smokehouse, even though it wasn't a business in any genuine sense. Just orders placed informally by neighbors who'd heard about my brisket, which I smoked for 14 hours at a time until it became so tender it barely held itself together. There were no signs, no advertisements, no lines of cars snaking around the block. Just my backyard, my smoker, and people who appreciated good meat. On a good weekend, I'd feed 20, sometimes 30 people, all of them drifting in and out like my yard was a secret pop-up restaurant. It wasn't long before the scent of smoked hickory drifted 3 doors down to the home of Margaret Susan Blackwell. Margaret had been president of the HOA for 7 straight years, primarily because no one else wanted the job. She was the kind of person who measured grass height with a ruler and sent out violation notices if you dared plant flowers that were not on the HOA-approved list. She controlled the neighborhood the way a hawk patrols a field, watching everything, swooping down at the slightest movement. And to her, the smoke from my backyard was less a harmless aroma and more a criminal attack on her pristine, manicured kingdom. It began with passive-aggressive notes placed neatly in my mailbox. The first one had a friendly tone that didn't match the accusation that my backyard gatherings were attracting unregulated traffic patterns. The next letter escalated to a formal warning accusing me of hosting unauthorized events on HOA property. The fact that my backyard was not HOA property didn't seem to bother her. Then the notes became less subtle. One of them included a photo of one of my ribs, perfectly cooked, beautifully barked, with the phrase, "Is this zoning compliant?" scrawled across it in red marker. At the time, I underestimated her. I thought she was just another bored suburban dictator trying to fill the void in her life with manufactured drama. But the fines started rolling in. $100 for commercial signage, even though the only sign she could have been referring to was the chalkboard menu I kept inside my garage for fun. $200 for food-related odors that exceeded allowable ambient thresholds. $350 for unauthorized commerce on HOA-regulated grounds, which was a fancy way of saying she didn't like my brisket being popular. I appealed every fine, and to my satisfaction, I won the first 2. Even the other board members thought Margaret had gone too far. But Margaret wasn't the type to back down. Instead, she doubled down. She called an emergency board meeting and somehow pushed through new bylaw amendments designed specifically to target backyard cooking done for profit. It was the most obvious legislative ambush I'd ever seen. When that didn't stop me, she escalated again. I heard a faint buzzing during one of my busiest weekends and looked up to see a drone circling overhead. Margaret was using it to record footage of my backyard. She filed complaints with the health department, the fire department, and even animal control, claiming my barbecue attracted dangerous wildlife. One of my regular customers, Patricia, a lawyer with a sharp tongue and a quicker wit, told me Margaret had been canvassing the neighborhood, warning people that I was running an underground meat syndicate. Most neighbors laughed in her face, especially the ones who came by every Saturday for brisket. But Margaret kept going. Things reached a turning point when she convinced 2 other board members that my backyard was an illegal restaurant destroying property values. She presented a 40-page report, complete with graphs showing hypothetical smoke dispersion patterns and imaginary property value declines, to the entire HOA. I attended that meeting carrying a tray of my jalapeno mac and cheese. Half the room was eating it while Margaret lectured them about commercial kitchen codes. The irony was delicious. But then the day came when she called in the cavalry. I had just pulled a 12-pound brisket off the smoker, letting it rest on my cutting board when multiple official vehicles rolled into my driveway. The 2 officers, the fire marshal and the health inspector, all looked like they'd been dragged into something they wanted no part of. The younger officer kept stealing glances at the brisket like it was the only bright thing in his day. The health inspector handed me a printed complaint, filled with accusations that ranged from vaguely plausible to absolutely deranged. According to Margaret, I was guilty of unregulated meat sales, unsafe firewood storage, fire hazards created by flammable hickory behavior, and something about unauthorized peach-based desserts. The fire marshal examined my setup and actually laughed. Everything was exactly to code. The health inspector asked for my documentation, expecting me to have nothing. Instead, I handed him a folder thicker than the one he carried. Cottage food operator license? Check. Smoke compliance waiver from the city? Check. Backyard zoning exemption? I'd obtained preemptively. Food handler certificate, liability insurance, safety inspection reports, all included. The inspector flipped through my paperwork with increasing disbelief. I had prepared for this day like a man preparing for battle. Eventually, the older police officer shook his head and said the whole ordeal felt like a waste of everyone's time. They all left without shutting me down. The younger officer looked back longingly at the brisket before following the others. Margaret watched the entire scene unfold from her driveway. When they all drove away without closing my operation, her face turned a shade of purple even my blackberry barbecue sauce had never achieved. That night, I found a note taped to my smoker. "This ends now. I know where your firewood supplier lives." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just pettiness anymore. This was obsession. I wasn't about to let an HOA president intimidate me or threaten the people who kept my smoker fed. So I called Patricia, who happened to be one of my most loyal customers. Together, we filed a lawsuit against both Margaret and the HOA for harassment, defamation, emotional distress, and violation of my rights. Patricia practically vibrated with excitement. She had been waiting for someone to challenge Margaret's reign of terror. Then came the discovery phase, and the discovery phase was glorious. Margaret's downfall was her compulsive record-keeping. She documented everything, including things she absolutely shouldn't have. We found receipts showing she'd used HOA funds to buy her surveillance drone. We found invoices for legal consultations about neighborhood grill containment strategies. We found a cease and desist template she'd drafted titled Pork Offenders. And then we found the emails. Oh, the emails. Emails to board members with subject lines like Operation Charcoal, Emergency Brisket Situation Escalating, and How to Smoke Out Garrett Legally. Emails to her sister admitting she had no legal grounds to shut me down, but was determined to make my life so miserable I would quit. One email read, "If I have to smell hickory smoke one more Saturday, I'm gonna lose my mind. This neighborhood was perfect before that meat-obsessed jarhead moved in." Patricia nearly danced when she read that. It proved bias, intent, and personal vendetta. Better still, we discovered that Margaret had submitted the majority of the 37 complaints herself, often under slightly altered names to make them appear like they came from different residents. 34 complaints came from Margaret, her husband, or her adult daughter who didn't even live in the neighborhood. The remaining 3 were about the smell, and 2 of those complainants were now weekly customers. When the court date arrived on a crisp October morning, Margaret showed up with a lawyer who looked like he'd been borrowed from a low-budget infomercial. Patricia brought a digital presentation titled Smoke and Freedom, which the judge tolerated with a sigh until she realized how methodically it dismantled Margaret's entire case. The judge, Roberta Harrison, had the demeanor of a woman who suffered no nonsense. Her irritation grew with every piece of evidence we presented. When Margaret's attorney tried to claim that my barbecue business threatened the cultural identity of the neighborhood, Judge Harrison actually chuckled. Then Patricia played the final piece of evidence, the video. Margaret herself, 2 months before any complaints, standing in my backyard during the 4th of July party, gnawing on ribs and proclaiming them the best she had ever tasted. She went back for seconds, then thirds, and even asked me for extra sauce. Her lawyer visibly deflated. Then came the email Margaret had sent me the next morning, asking if I could cater her book club. That email, polite and enthusiastic, was the nail in the coffin. Under questioning, Margaret finally cracked. She admitted that her grudge began when the HOA selected me, not her sister-in-law's catering company, to handle the food at the annual summer picnic. She couldn't stand it. She believed the recognition belonged to her family, not to some backyard amateur. Her jealousy had driven everything that followed. Judge Harrison ruled in my favor on all counts. Margaret was ordered to pay $25,000 in damages out of her own pocket. The HOA had to cover $15,000 in legal fees and issue a formal public apology. I received a permanent exemption from all HOA cooking restrictions. And the judge strongly recommended the HOA implement term limits and warned Margaret that further harassment could lead to criminal charges. Margaret's face went from purple to gray to something resembling week-old spinach. That same evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting. By a vote of 47-3, Margaret was removed from her presidency and banned from holding any HOA office ever again. The only votes in her favor came from her husband and 2 board members who hadn't attended the court hearing. Margaret stood up, knocked over her chair, and screamed that we would all regret this when property values collapsed and the neighborhood descended into smoke and madness. Then she stormed out, slamming the door behind her hard enough to crack the frame. Silverstone Gardens has never smelled better since. My smoker has burned every weekend, my customers have tripled, and even the fire marshal stops by. Not for inspections, just for brisket. And though Margaret still lives 3 houses down, she now avoids me entirely. Whenever the wind blows smoke in her direction, I swear I can feel victory in the air.